So once again, click on the daily participation and click resubmit. The text box will open up. So the Imperial Presidency, and just to recap, back in September, I mentioned the Imperial Presidency as an idea of a growing and all-powerful executive position. And back in September, I mentioned that there are three things that help contribute to that. Media attention be one of them, obviously, with the advent of radio and TV. So it focuses our attention on one person and also their popularity or lack thereof. Congressional giveaways, the fact that Congress has eroded some of their own powers, like the power over tariffs and trade and immigration. President Trump was caught in some flack in that earlier in his first term, but that's not really his fault. He was given those powers, or the office was given those powers over the past few decades. And then war and foreign powers as commander-in-chief and the signatory of treaties and other things like that. Obviously, they carry a lot of weight as a representative to the world and the global community. But to expand upon this, the Imperial Presidency has also grown because of what we call a loose construction or loose interpretation of the Constitution. The fact that it's not followed literally. And even the people that claim to be strict constructionists, they follow the Constitution literally word for word, they even on occasion fall into the trap that the Constitution doesn't say specifically what to do, so maybe we'll just make it up as a guideline and try to fill in the gaps for modern day need. And probably one of the first major examples of this was President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was not involved with writing the Constitution. Unlike the Declaration, he was actually out of the country as an ambassador at the time of the constitutional construction. But when he did arrive back in the United States, he was very suspicious of this bigger government. He believed in smaller government, states' rights, things like that. And so when he became president reluctantly, because he didn't like the idea of this big office, he was of the notion that we should follow the Constitution word for word and never do anything beyond that. However, he found himself in a predicament because the country of France, under Napoleon, needed a lot of money for war and didn't have an interest in their faraway territory of New France, which of course existed in what we would call the Louisiana Territory. And so when they offered to sell it at an amazing price, Thomas Jefferson looked, of course, everywhere in the Constitution where it said the president can go and make a purchase on behalf of the country for a large tract of land, and didn't say anything about that. So he found himself in a pickle. But like with many people who have a more conservative outlook on government, he found himself in a position where he had to go for the more liberal aspect and say, well, we'll just say the Constitution allows me to do this. So he made the deal. Of course, it would eventually, for budgetary reasons, have to be approved by Congress. But needless to say, it is difficult to be a strict constructionist or a literal interpreter of the Constitution. So over time, presidents have taken that notion of the loose interpretation, and Congress really just hasn't corrected them enough. And so the growing power of the presidency has basically happened because the Constitution can't spell out every single situation that is going to happen. And so the executive branch often interprets that they have permission to go beyond what it says. Then, of course, there's the idea of unitary versus the plural executive. And these are two concepts of leadership that exist throughout governments in the world. The unitary executive idea is that all power is concentrated in one place, whereas the plural executive is concentrated in multiple points. Now, literally, it can be assumed that the office of the president is unitary executive. And that's because of two clauses in the Constitution. One of them in Article 2 says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States, period. It doesn't say and also in all these other places. And that's called the vested clause, basically saying the president has executive power. And the other one is called the taking clause. It says take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so that's directly in reference to the president as well. So looking at that, it is basically said, even though Congress has created all of these other agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Attorney General's Office, the Justice Department, Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, and so on, and they all have heads that are approved by the Senate, they're still underneath the president. So a big believer in unitary executive theory would basically say, even though the FBI is an independent policing agency, They have terms that usually last longer than a presidency. They still have to do whatever the president says. So if you take that to the full conclusion, if the president decides to go rob a McDonald's at gunpoint and steal all the cash, the FBI can't really investigate that. Or if it does, the president has the right to say, don't investigate that. And so a unitary executive would say, no matter who the president would be, Obama, Trump, George W. Bush, that they should be able to have the final say on any executive matters at all. And they might even go further than that by supporting the idea that it doesn't literally say in the Constitution that Congress can interview and request evidence and draw witnesses from the executive branch. So a unitary executive theory supporter would also say Congress has no right of oversight. If they believe the president has done something wrong, then they should impeach and remove him. Otherwise, they can't do anything about what the president does when it comes to their actions. A plural executive is a little bit different, and obviously we don't have a system where Congress chooses other executives or the people choose other executives. That system doesn't exist, which is why so much support is given to the unitary theory. Where does a plural system exist? Most of the states have this. For instance, Pennsylvania, we have a governor that's elected, but separately we have an attorney general, we have an auditor general, and we have a treasurer. So there's the potential right now they're all the same party, but those three positions are up for election this year. If the Republicans would win all three of those seats, it's possible that you could have a governor and those three offices in opposition. And the point is, of course, is that the auditor general should inspect the executive branch, making sure they're doing everything correctly. The attorney general is a law enforcement officer, so if they need to investigate a crime being committed by the executive branch, they have the right to do that, and the governor can't interfere. And then the treasurer has the ability to spend the money of the budget properly, so that way the governor can't make political decisions. Well, the legislature said I should spend this much, but I don't want to, so I'm going to withhold that. They don't have the right to do that. That's up to the Treasury. And so these types of independent positions weaken the governor a little bit and do spread out executive authority. Texas is probably the most significant governor's position when it comes to the plural system. There are over a dozen different executives elected, including the railroad commissioner and other ridiculous things. So because it's funny, because when George W. Bush ran for president, that was his big resume item, that he was the governor of Texas, but actually it's one of the weakest governor's positions in the entire country. And that is done in states where they are suspicious of having a strong executive position. But the presidency is not designed that way. And so that brings about questions of whether or not the attorney general should be a separate position from all the rest, so that way they just don't do whatever a president says. So that's all about the other ideas involving the imperial presidency. Does anybody have any questions about that? Anything at all? All right. So go ahead and